we have been discussing so far the more direct impact of violence against schools and students, teachers. We'd like to discuss the indirect, more indirect impact of armed conflicts and violence on children's access to education. So to discuss this, maybe I'd like my left-hand side panel to discuss the problem and come also with elements of responses, and then I will turn to the legal panel on my right-hand side to discuss this issue. So Megan, maybe you could start discussing the problem and the possible responses.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start in doing so with just maybe questioning the idea of direct or indirect impacts of armed conflict on children's access to education. In some cases, we may consider that an attack on a school might be in the frame of direct impacts. But just to play with that idea a little bit, I mean, is the targeted killing of teachers or students whilst in school, is that a direct or an indirect impact? I very much doubt that the person affected, meaning the child killed, the family affected by that, the teacher threatened, would consider it to be an indirect effect. But I would say that it does in itself, such acts do in themselves have more indirect or long-lasting effects. We spoke about some of them earlier, which is to say that the military use of schools, attacks on schools can have immediate physical effects on the infrastructures, effects on students and teachers themselves, effects on physical, psychological well-being, but also in the longer term on psychosocial, on community well-being, on the education of arguably a generation. I think that here maybe the question from my perspective is not to consider the just attacks on the school, military use of schools, I think as Ellen mentioned earlier, in isolation or Gloria too, of other broader violations, but rather to understand the various and again very complex impacts of such practices and other violations of IHL on children's access to education and on them more broadly speaking. And I mentioned earlier that I think this theme, the impact of armed conflict on children's access to education, it's complex, but it's very often overlooked. So that would be, in terms of recommendations, basically my first in terms of a response, is that really the way we should be looking at this is to better integrate such considerations into our, in this case I'll speak from the humanitarian perspective, into our humanitarian assessments, into our analyses, and into our response. Another way of saying that might be to mainstream. You know, we hear that word around a lot, but it may well apply here to mainstream such considerations into our work. Not to take up too much of our precious time here, but I would perhaps just highlight a couple of things that I haven't heard mentioned so far into this consideration in the frame of other impacts, and that is not necessarily, but maybe related to military use of schools or attacks on schools, but also and otherwise in situations of armed conflict, as children are very often, or sometimes are, arrested and detained, and very often, very seldom is provision made for their access to education whilst in detention. So that, in terms of response or recommendations, that is something that I can say and encourage, heartily my colleagues in ICRC and otherwise in the room to integrate that into our detention-related work, into our dialogue with detaining authorities, and to monitor that when we are in places of detention or otherwise. Are children being provided with access to education or not? Of what quality, of what nature? And also I would just like to point out that earlier we discussed the military use of schools and its impacts, but some of the impacts of military use of schools very often and almost immediately include displacement. And ICRC is concerned about the situation of displaced children who may have to go, and very often do have to go, without education for extended periods of time. In that regard, and perhaps lastly, just to say that there's also the use of schools, and this frequently happens, it was mentioned perhaps differently by Jeff otherwise, not for military purposes per se, but the use of schools for other purposes, like shelters for displaced populations. And just that we also consider the impact on local or resident children when such facilities are used for sometimes very long periods of time to accommodate IDP populations. And this too, we should integrate into our work. And perhaps, as just one example, in a preventive way, contingency planning, whatever you want to call it, our dialogue with those who may engage in such practices, it's not only military, sometimes it's local authorities who might do that, is to consider alternatives to doing so.
So I appreciate that we're in a very positive frame of mind in terms of the protection of education. I think this is a fairly sympathetic audience, and most folks believe that the protection of education is really genuinely important, and why isn't there more emphasis on this and more engagement with this? However, in the past 4 years since I've been working on this issue, I have faced two very challenging questions. Number one is, again, speaking as a legal program manager, how is international law even relevant? When these awful crises and conflicts happen, you're trying to tell me that international law is protecting students from these barbaric violations and crimes. I was 2 weeks ago at a conference at Qatar University on international law and Syria, and for 2 days, most people were pretty down about international law, and it was getting very negative. At the end of that conference, there was a prosecutor from a number of international tribunals who actually said, listen, I actually believe that international law is completely relevant. It provides protection, it provides deterrence, and we are actually in the age of accountability. And it completely changed the environment in that conference, where people thought, oh my gosh, so okay, if I look at the international domain and I think of all these different international mechanisms, it might happen 40 years later, and that's horrific, but it's happening, and there seems to be more and more opportunities and movement in that direction. And I would link that also to protection of education in the context of international legal protections. There seems to be, in the past couple of years, more and more movements towards focusing on legal protections for education, and that this is a positive movement forward. So I find that I'm defending international law often, and I think that at first I was a bit off-put by that, but it's really important to constantly, defend international law as a viable protection for education. And for me, the most compelling aspect of that is, I was actually speaking with Save the Children colleagues last night, and really, and talking about the victims' perspective in this, and that in reports on armed conflicts, out of all of the issues that impact victims, the second thing that most victims say is that they want education. After protection, the second thing is education, more than nutrition, more than other rights or provisions, education. So, I can't forget that in terms of integrating that in international legal protections. The second question then that I get that I have to surmount is, okay, so if we then accept that international law is important and provides protection, how are you really going to focus on the protection of education when you're talking about torture and genocide and all of these other international crimes? So you want to focus on education, really? And I think that the way that we've responded to that is to say all of these international crimes impact on education. So when we actually look at education and consider that it is fundamentally integrated into every aspect of society. And so if you're talking about torture, and you're talking about the torture of teachers, or you're talking about enforced disappearances, or you're talking about child soldiers, all of these international crimes, you can find the link with their impact on education, and you need to do that. One of the examples is that we've done work with the International Criminal Court and looking at the impact of child soldiering as a crime on the provision of education, and ensuring that got into the sentencing phase, and then very importantly with respect to reparations. And I'm going to wrap this up right now, but looking at reparations and looking at these remedies and ensuring that education is interlaced in all of these elements of criminal procedures and processes. The last point is that utilizing international machinery like the UN and like international criminal courts and other processes is incredibly important. But going toward what I think both Jeff and Stuart were saying, and then reiterated by Megan, is you need to work with these huge global mechanisms, but having one-on-one conversations with people is also absolutely critical. And I've had conversations with military officers, and the first response is, I'm not really in education, really. And then we start talking about the impacts. We start talking about the consequences and the disutility. And I'm not joking, in a single conversation, it can go from, this isn't that important, this is kind of abstract, to, oh my gosh, I want to be an honorable soldier. And as an honorable soldier, why would I use a school and deny a generation their education? So I would certainly emphasize both the huge abstract international level, but then the one-on-one interactions that you have with people as well. Thank you.
So perhaps just a couple of statistics to show that armed conflict destroys opportunities for education on a massive scale. for some of the reasons that have come out in the conversation today. Conflict-affected states have some of the worst education indicators. The number of children out of school in the world, around half of those live in conflict-affected countries. And in fact, this has gone up. It was 42% in 2008, and it means and it's now 28.5 million primary school-age children. There's progress made in the other countries, and slowly all kids are getting into school, but it's not the case in conflict-affected countries. And girls make up 55% of the total, are worse affected, and we came to some of the reasons why that is the case as well, not in great detail. And also children in conflict-affected countries are more likely to drop out, and only 65% make it to the last grade of primary school, and it's 86% in other poor countries. And what's really very important is that conflict and the lack of educational opportunities really destroys the hopes and ambitions of generations of children. And I think that's kind of a message that's important, and that's why the work that everyone is doing, also including therefore also very much in the international human rights arena, is very important. And so then the point in terms of perhaps one point in terms of what can be done. What I think is really important is to continue the work at global and national level, advocacy and working on change, to get greater acknowledgement that armed conflict damages education, and that the damage to students, teachers and society is severe and long-lasting, and that this needs to be followed through with action at multiple levels so that there is real change.
What we did with the report with two colleagues, Takmina Karimova and Giorgiaka, was to look systematically at how UN human rights mechanisms had addressed respect for the right to education in situations of armed violence, what we call insecurity, and in situations of armed conflict, to see to what extent they'd been addressed and how they'd been addressed. And obviously there are copies there, I've only got a few minutes, but maybe just highlight a few of the findings. The importance of non-discrimination continuing during a situation of conflict. The fact that, of course, an armed conflict breaking out does not mean that your treaty, and to the extent they exist, customary law obligations to provide education don't end. You can't just throw up your hands as a state and say, oh, well, there's a war going on, we don't have to do anything more. That's clearly not the case. At the same time, though, human rights law is realistic in accepting that to a certain extent outside areas in which hostilities are being conducted, but especially within areas where hostilities are being conducted, there are constraining factors. There are things that the state suffers, that the communities suffer, that it is not possible to repair immediately. So I think human rights law does understand that there are significant constraints in armed conflict. Other issues that we saw highlighted in the views of different committees, special rapporteurs, treaty bodies, also the commissions of inquiry, the working group set up under the Security Council, are the importance of education is not just about children. Of course, it's first and foremost about children, but tertiary education is also important. Education for adults that didn't receive primary or secondary during their childhood is also important, particularly in situations where there's been prolonged conflict for many years, and children will have missed out during their childhood on the opportunities to which they have a right. It's also not just about access. If I can have a pop at the Millennium Development Goals for a second, we hope that next year the issue of it's not just about access, it's also about quality of education. The incentive to certain international organisations to stuff the classrooms full on the first day of school, so you've got 80 kids in a school room, and then 4 weeks later none of them are there anymore. That's not what the right to education is about, and hopefully whatever follows the MDGs will recognise that. And then finally, a group that we often tend to forget about, that's persons with disabilities. These are sort of the unseen, the unheard victims in armed conflict, more vulnerable to attacks during conflict, and certainly vulnerable to loss of their right to education during armed conflict. A study that's been put before the Human Rights Council this session talks about their rights. It's a good start, but the word conflict doesn't appear once in it. We've got the CEOP, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, that has a specific provision calling on respect, protection for persons with disabilities in situations of armed conflict and disasters. But what does that mean in practice, and how can we transform that into policy? There are a lot of operational as well as legal challenges in front of us. Thank you.
So I have the difficult task of looking at IHL and whether there is a right to education under IHL. Well, when we look at IHL, you might think, okay, it's not formulated around rights, so will I find something about the right to education? Everything is about obligations of belligerent parties, prohibitions. But if we give really a careful look at the Geneva Conventions and additional protocols, we can find a number of provisions which refer to the notion of education. Actually, if we take just the 4th Geneva Convention, we see that there is, for instance, the obligation of belligerent parties to facilitate education for orphaned and separated children. There are also provisions when it comes to belligerent occupation. So, for instance, the occupying power has to facilitate the functioning of education institutions in the occupied territory. That's a very important aspect. Also, detaining power have to facilitate and to provide education to children who are interned. So we see that all these provisions, even if they are not formulated under a right to education, are totally relevant when it comes to the notion of access to education in non-conflict situations. Also in the additional protocols, and additional protocol 2 is fantastic in this regard, because in Article 4 you have a rule which is very strong. It says children should receive an education. And this is valid not only for armed forces, but also for organized non-state armed groups. So here again we see the complementarity with the human rights law and the right to education. Because if under human rights law, non-state armed groups are not directly bound, under international humanitarian law, there is no doubt that this is the case. So this very strong provision of AP2 is very something which can be used also in a dialogue with organized non-state armed groups. Now, I wanted also to raise that, to show the importance of access to education for the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, I would like to refer to an action plan which was adopted at the last 31st International Conference of the Red Cross and Red Crescent. And in this action plan, you have one paragraph which is precisely on the notion of education in armed conflict situations. And states, national societies, etc., can pledge on this aspect of the action plan. So definitely this is an issue for which we want to work on as well. And now regarding the Lucens guidelines, if I may say a few words, I would say that we followed with great interest the development and the writing of those guidelines as an external observer. And definitely the analysis made by the Global Coalition that there is an important humanitarian issue around the military use of schools is something that we completely share. We share the fact that there is a humanitarian issue there and that we need to work more on this. We understand the Lucens guidelines as being a non-binding instrument and as an instrument which does not purport to change the law, but rather to take the law as it is, as a tool also to limit and restrict the military use of schools, but more profoundly to change behaviors. And I think there are many key words which have been said today. The notion of policy. Okay, even if something is allowed under international humanitarian law, states can go always further as a matter of policy, looking at different humanitarian considerations. There is also the word alternatives, I think, which is very important. Because if we look at all the humanitarian issues that can be linked with the military use of schools, then a possibility would be for belligerent states and non-state parties to really look at other alternatives in order not to be led to have to use schools for military purposes. So that perspective at not trying to change the law, but rather as looking at behaviors and trying to have an impact on that is promising and is a good basis of discussion.
Thank you. Professor Kahn?
Yeah, I would only like to suggest that we be careful not to infer from the limited positive treatment of rights or protection of access to education that that's the exclusive treatment. The core purpose of international humanitarian law, or the humanitarian prong of the law of armed conflict, is to mitigate the adverse consequences of armed violence in a manner that facilitates the ability of belligerents to accomplish their very difficult task, but has a minimal effect. And I think the benefit of events like this and the contributions of the people who've been involved in this issue is to raise awareness that interference with access to education does have profound, immediate, and long-term consequences, and therefore that is an effect that belligerents and commanders who are responsible for their conduct should seek to mitigate. And again, that's why I was surprised that there wasn't a reference to the Martins Clause in the guidelines. So my only point is that it's under-inclusive to look through the articles of the conventions and the protocols and to say, well, it mentions it here, and it mentions it here, and it mentions it here, because the risk of that is that if you're trying to avoid a broader obligation, you say, well, we're not here, and we're not here, and we're not here. What's more important is to look at the core purpose of the law, to recognize that this is a negative consequence, a significant negative consequence, and to emphasize that the obligation is therefore apparent that military commanders should do whatever is feasible to mitigate that negative consequence. And then I think to demonstrate, and again, this is something I think that would be persuasive in the guidelines, that the purpose of this is not just humanitarian, it's pragmatic. There are negative consequences to interfering with education, and there are positive consequences to facilitating the continuing function of education in a community that's affected by a conflict for the warring parties themselves. And therefore, that's something that they should seek to achieve as opposed to avoid.
I don't want to finish without taking a couple of burning questions and short questions, please. So, yes, thank you.
My question is, there is wrong education and right education, and sometimes the education is the cause of the conflict. The lack of education and the wrong education, because there are details, and there are the international laws, for example, for the historical monuments, there are many, but they are not applied. How can the international apply? Because there is international and the local law. And providing education, my question is, how can laws maybe apply in such conflict situation where it is chaotic, you cannot communicate with the groups, or the example of Afghanistan, where the woman education is forbidden because it's seen as against law, or the situation in Syria, the conflict is terrible, so people cannot, the laws cannot be reached or here. So how can the laws which already exist theoretically be applied on in field?
Hélène?
No, that's an excellent point, and it's one that we didn't address in this in this conversation this afternoon. But indeed, we sometimes say, you know, there are two sides of education, and there is the positive side, what education contributes, but there is also the other side where education can be a cause of conflict, because and actually that often is and often that gets exacerbated in situation of armed conflict in countries, for example, where particular areas that are high conflict are underserved vis-a-vis others, and you exacerbate inequalities that sort of continue also a cycle of grievance and so on. And then there is what is taught and how it is taught, and differences between groups, and buy-in into a curriculum, and so on. So it's all quite complex, and you're absolutely right. There's not enough time to go into this, but certainly there is a recognition of this. The question of implementing the law, I think I would leave to others, but also to say, you know, what you said about Afghanistan is very complex, and there are many attacks on schools in Afghanistan. But there are sometimes things that communities can do also, and they are in protecting the education of their own children. That's not enough, and it doesn't answer the question about, well, how do you apply the law, but there are still, you know, I think it's very important to also recognize that courage of children, teachers and parents in trying to maintain access under these very difficult conditions. So, and that's what's happening, for example, in Afghanistan.
I mean, that's a question you could ask for any rule of international humanitarian law. So my response to that is, it brings to mind the parable, there's only one way to eat an elephant, and that's one bite at a time. And this is a bite, right? So you do the best you can, you try and develop standards, best practices, you do the best you can to educate, raise awareness, hold people accountable, and over time, momentum builds, and the problem becomes less and less severe. But that has to be a better solution than simply saying, it's too hard, we're never going to be able to reach certain areas of conflict, so we might as well not even try.
I have one question. I think it relates to this issue of the difficulty of implementing international humanitarian law and maybe the trickling of it down towards difficult settings. And I would challenge this a little bit further and say, specifically drawing the example that was given earlier about half the world's out-of-school children are in areas of armed conflict. My question is, what about the other ones? Where are they? I think from what we know, they're mostly in other countries that are not officially armed conflicts, so non-conflict settings, that are nevertheless characterized by high levels of violence, lethal violence, linked usually to gangs or organized crime, and have high inequalities. Moreover, we can add to this those children in these situations who do go to school, but the quality of education, as it was brought up earlier, is not good enough, so they're effectively underschooled. So, which leads me to a second point, one being, two more points actually. One being, is our view of education and conflict limited? Should we also take into account these other non-conflict settings where violence is rampant and education is threatened, directly or indirectly, and training, taking a broader view of education? And also, how can we imagine implementing IHL in these settings? I know that it's not directly applicable. I do know the ICRC works in some of these areas, like certain favelas or slums. But specifically in terms of law, do we just then leave it onto the local states to work with it, or what?
I'm not sure why you'd want to apply IHL outside a situation of armed conflict. I think the obligations to respect, protect and ensure education are far more detailed, are far more comprehensive in human rights law. And I think it would be far preferable to re-emphasise the human rights obligations of the state in situations of armed conflicts that don't amount to armed conflicts, of armed violence that don't amount to armed conflicts. So I think that's where the effort should be put, not on trying to extend the application of IHL.
I agree on that we cannot really transpose IHL rules in situations which are not armed conflict situations, because you would bring in some rules which would not be appropriate for situations of violence which do not amount to armed conflict situations. So here we are not in a framework where IHL is a lex specialis. It doesn't apply. So we have to start with human rights law, and even if the right to education is very broad, very general, we can have a look at what human rights bodies have said and done in the field of the right to education to see what kind of protection can be afforded. But definitely in those kind of situations, the starting point is human rights law and domestic law. We shouldn't forget about domestic law, which sometimes goes much further than international law.
To the point of ICRC, for example, amongst others, doing work in situations of armed conflict, but also other situations of violence. Indeed, you mentioned favelas, you mentioned Rio. There's some other contexts, places like Medellin or otherwise, where the impacts, we should also consider, we're not talking in the frame of armed conflict, and we're not talking in the frame of IHL, but we're talking about the impacts of armed violence on children. I mean, my role within ICRC is that of child protection advisor, and our mandate at ICRC is armed conflict and OSV, other situations of violence. The impacts, be they, again, physical, psychological, community-based, can be quite profound and different, but equally complex, if you like. I don't know if there are any comments from the floor that we might wish to make on that, colleagues there, but in situations of other situations of violence, sometimes the barriers are a bit more invisible, perhaps, including maybe in urban areas, in cities, than they may be in situations of armed conflict. It may be less clear with whom to speak and how in some instances, but again, the complexity and the effects, immediate and long-term, are profound.
Before we conclude, I just want to give you one last word to each of you to summarize maybe in one sentence what needs to be done in the coming year, according to you, to tackle the issues we discussed this afternoon. So one measure that need to be taken in order to address this issue, and I will try to mix our legal panel with our non-legal panel, because I don't know how to define it, but we are all trying to find solutions here. So maybe in one sentence, what would be the measure you would like to be adopted in the coming year?
We need to work on better implementation of international humanitarian law, and we need to take seriously the conduct of hostilities principles, such as the principle of precaution against the effects of attacks.
One practical way that states can do just that is by coming forward to support the finalization of the Lausanne guidelines in a way that ensures that they incorporate international humanitarian law, human rights law, and best practices as they exist around the world to ensure that we can establish better protections for schools and universities from military use.
I would say that if we can see within a year, if we can recognize and act within a year, in the sense that I mentioned earlier, armed conflict imposes immense suffering on children. I mentioned that it impacts heavily on children's access to education, but it's overlooked. If that last part of the sentence could be changed within a year, that this is part of our core business. We don't use the word business much in the humanitarian or human rights realm, but it's part of what our various mandates say. It's part of what the law says and affords for children, families, and communities. It's part of what we should be assessing, analyzing, and responding to, is the impacts of armed conflict.
I would like to see more exposure of the guidelines to the military community itself, and in particular the military legal community, and maybe have more events like this with a much more significant population of military personnel engaged in operational practice, so they could contribute perhaps to refining the guidelines so that when ultimately they're that much more acceptable to the constituents, you want to embrace them.
So building on what my colleagues said earlier, I would say that within this next year, if every single person in this room could follow up on this conference and take the issue of protection of education back with them into their mandates and personally take this forward, that would make some significant changes.
I have a few really, but in the context of this panel and the discussion this afternoon, what I'd like to see in more countries is greater partnerships between different types of actors to ensure better monitoring and reporting of attacks on education and the use of schools by the military, and followed through with real action that will lead to change, and I think it can be done.
I guess it's reinforced the stigmatization that's already been done by people here on the panel and people in the audience against the use of schools by the military, and in particular against attacks that are directed against or that impact on schools. I think the stigmatization ultimately is what will help us.
Before I thank the panelists, I'd like to thank all those who organized the conference, and it has been quite a lot of work and good teamwork. So Thanks to Margot Champex from Protection, my colleagues Raphaël Dallaire, Geneviève Monnier, Bea van Hove, and Anne Quintin for the organization of the panel and the room and the invitations. And thanks for the technical support. We have Chris Nicolas here with the camera. We have also our colleague from Fréquence TV, Nicolas, at the back, organizing the sound and video. So thanks to all of you. And finally, thanks to the panelists, we had an incredibly rich discussion. We had very passionate people, lots of wealth of expertise, examples, possible solutions. So really, big thanks to all of you. Thank you very much.